Welcome to the first day of March here in London. It's sunny at least, but it is a little bit cold. So we got teased with a bit of springtime weather last week, and I think we're in for another cold week now, but maybe just a little bit, few more days before we actually see spring. Really appreciate everybody who's switched in and tuned in right now. Hopefully you will settle in and are looking forward to this conversation as much as I am. I have briefly introduced myself once before, but I'll just do it again for those who have joined since. My name is Eileen Burbidge. I'm the Executive Director at Fertifa. I'm not going to do an advert for Fertifa, but just for contextual sort of guidance. Fertifa is Europe's largest reproductive, hormonal, and sexual health benefits provider. We work with great companies across the UK, Ireland, and most of the countries in continental Europe as well. We provide health benefits which come in the form of education materials, obviously, as well as well-being support, one-to-one well-being support, and assistance with financial reimbursement and administration from companies that range from the likes of Meta to Osborne Clark, the law firm, to Bain Capital, Lululemon, Virgin, and also Monzo Bank. Having said that, I wanted to sort of put that out there in disclosure, and obviously we're joined by Kunal, and I'll let him introduce himself in a second, who is one of the general managers at Monzo, but he is participating and lending his time for us today on a personal capacity. So he's not sort of speaking on behalf of Monzo, even though we are proud to be a partner of theirs. And so he's very, very generously going to bring his personal lens to this, given his reproductive health journey or fertility journey that he and his wife have been through. So having said all of that, if I could ask you, Kunal, maybe just to introduce yourself and to give a little bit more context about that, we can then just sort of dive into it. I'll put a bit of, I guess, framing around this topic and maybe what we'll touch on or what we plan to touch on, given the title is, you know, what we think are going to be the 5 biggest fertility challenges for employees in this coming year. But if you could do a quick introduction, we'll then go into that framing and then maybe just have a chat, and hopefully we'll also get Q&A as we go. So people, please do feel free to lodge your questions in the Q&A module that you see there in Zoom. It can be anonymous. We're very happy to not share any personal information and identifiable information, given that this is also being recorded and might be watched back later. But please do engage, interact. Kunal and I know each other, and so we enjoy chatting to each other all the time. But I think what's going to make this really valuable is if we hear from all of you who are listening in and have questions and want to guide us or have us steer us to talk about specific topics or answer specific questions that you might have. Over to you, Kunal.
Thanks, Eileen. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you in a conversation like this. You know, going through what my wife, Aarti, and I have been through the last 3 years is quite a journey. I'm pleased to say that it felt like a rewarding one. I'm now the very proud father of a 9-week-old little girl. Her name is Arya. She might show up on the call if she wakes up, but no promises. My objective in this call is to be as open and as transparent as I can be. I'm very happy to not be anonymous. I will be sharing personal details. Let's start with who I am. I'm a 48-year-old male of Indian origin. My wife's 41. We've been married for about 5 years now, just over 5 years now, and I've been on this journey together for the last 3 years. And my objective here is to share as much as I can professionally. As you mentioned, I'm the general manager of Monzo, but this one is about much more about the journey than about the work I do. I will talk about Monzo and the role they played if it comes up, but I'm very happy to take all the questions you'd like me to.
Thank you so much, and obviously congratulations. It is obviously just heartwarming to know that you've got a little one. I hope that we get to see her. That would be exciting. But also I should take the chance to say thank you for lending your time, particularly while you're still on caregiving leave. And so we really do appreciate that, and also understand that you're probably short on sleep as well. So just to frame the conversation, we had titled it as what we think and what we anticipate as an organization at Fertifa, based on our work with our clients and also prospective clients, and also in supporting our patients. what we think are going to be the sort of 5 biggest challenges that employees are going to face this year relating to fertility, and maybe in some respects, reproductive health more broadly. And I think the sort of, I'll summarize and just list off what the 5 are, because I think that's just give us anchors for our conversation. And I know that Kunal will have specific things that I think really resonate with him. And again, that he'll be able to sort of cultivate from his personal journey. I will try not to overshare too much or too TMI from my side, but I've had reproductive health journey as well, and went through 3 rounds of IVF in 2017 while I was working. So I think we'll be able to personalize it, but what's more important for both of us is to make sure that we help convey what's potentially relatable for all of you that are listening in, but maybe your employees, as well as other perspectives as well. Obviously, everybody's journey is absolutely different and the needs are absolutely different. And we are offering 2 perspectives, but the point of this discussion with all of you is actually to think about the breadth and the range and the scope, and therefore as employers or as well-being teams, how to support people through all of those. So I might be giving away, I guess, the punchline at the very top of this webinar, but the 5 that we had anticipated as, again, an organization were, first of all, the increasing pressures on the NHS. And actually, I know that we have some attendees who are not in the UK. I've already mentioned that we're the largest provider across all of Europe as well. So there might be people outside of the UK, but this will also apply to European countries as well. I do think, as someone who's now been in this country for 20 years, I treasure the NHS. We're all very, very grateful for the public healthcare systems that we have across Europe, but coming off of COVID, it's undeniable that the strains on the public healthcare system have never been greater. And so therefore, when you think about reproductive health and fertility, unfortunately, while it's clearly life-changing for us as individuals, they probably are a little bit lower down the list and not perceived as acute healthcare in terms of what's being prioritized. And so that's going to be top of mind for employees. A second point will be, and this I know Kunal will mention, and again, acknowledging that you're on your caregiver leave now, is how you balance, even if you get access to care, to treatment, whether it's through the public healthcare system or not, how you balance that with the demands of your career and your work. And again, we're doing this during a working day. We respect and really appreciate everybody lending their time, but there's so much to consider when you go through a reproductive health journey, a fertility journey, and how you can keep up and cope with that is obviously going to be a huge challenge for employees. Another point is about sort of just being able to talk about these experiences. Not everyone will want to, but to know that an organization is a safe place to start the conversation or ask a question about support, we think, is really going to weigh on people's minds. How will they know that their employer is going to welcome the conversation or even support them through the process? Or are they going to still be sort of put off by even bringing it up? And then the final 2 are ones that I think are not often considered when we think about fertility challenges or reproductive health broadly. As a woman, I can say I'm grateful that we're thinking more and more about women's reproductive health and what women have to be going through. But it's not just women, and that's one reason there's lots of reasons I wanted Kunal in this panel, but one of the reasons was to really highlight that this is not just a female challenge, it's not a female issue. And so talking about, for instance, what LGBT individuals, whether they're male or female, are going to want in terms of support, since every single one of them will need some type of support to become parents, might need, and then what generally might affect men's reproductive health is what we also think will be top of mind for people. And I know those are all really, really broad. We could do a webinar on each one of those 5 topics in and of themselves, but like I said, I wanted to put them out there as anchors, not as giving away the punchline. The idea is not to sort of keep you on a webinar for 40 minutes and then tell you what we think our top 5 are. They're to put those out there, also to gauge your reactions, to see if people would agree. There are now more than 125 people on this webinar, so thank you again. But there's got to be, people who would maybe, argue against or just debate what we saw as the top 5, maybe want to drill down on any of those more than others. And actually, in doing that, I'd like to go back to you, Kunal, and actually sort of maybe pick up one of the first points, which was about sort of sharing experiences. And if you don't mind, I don't want to pigeonhole you just from a man's perspective, but you happen to be a man. You've talked about, already your age, and you've given us some insight into your circumstances. But, we flagged that employees understanding whether or not their employers are going to support them and whether or not there's a safe place to have these conversations is really important. Do you mind actually giving us your thoughts on that?
Sure, absolutely. So I feel very lucky, very privileged to work in Monzo, where it was absolutely fair game to have a conversation like this, not just with my manager, but also far more importantly, with my peers and with my team, making it quite clear that there'll be times where I will need the help, I will need the support, I will need the time off. And unsurprisingly, it was a very sympathetic audience. And, and the truth is, as you go through this journey, um, because almost certainly as a woman, but even as a guy, there's um, it takes time. There's just a lot of stuff that um, uh, requires you to be there, and I certainly chose to want to be there, even if I wasn't physically required to be at an appointment. Um, the IVF process demanded far more from my wife than it did from me physically in terms of like time and the impact on our respective bodies. Um, but but I chose to want to be there, and I found that communicating early and sharing at work that this is what we were going through allowed me to create that time to make it to every appointment, to be there for every test. And it was a difficult journey. We didn't get pregnant quickly, and far from quickly. And then when we did, we had a couple of miscarriages, and that was hard. But again, letting folks know that you're on this journey allows them to understand when you have that setback, and give you the time and sometimes the space to deal with it. It's much less about policies, though there are policies that are almost that are very supportive, but it's more about the empathy, and I think that comes with sharing. And if I may just broaden that a little bit from sharing at the workplace, which I think is super important to do. I went through this interesting process about sharing more generally. Um, my wife, Aarti, she's super chatty, man. So she would share about infertility and going through IVF and all of that quite broadly. Certainly when she would chat with girlfriends, and I would either sometimes join the end of the conversation or have listen in, and you know yeah, I'd say, like, really, did you really have to share that? Like, was that a necessary conversation? But I learned something through that process, because one out of every three people would turn around and share back, and they wanted to share. They just needed that opening to have that conversation. And I found that we learned so much through other people's experiences. Um, and some of the tougher decisions we had to take were were felt balanced because we thought other people who'd taken them, and that gave me the courage, if I may use the word, to actually to start talking to other guys about it. And this is not meant to be a men do this and women do that conversation, but guys just generally don't chat about reproductive issues. Okay, we just don't. It doesn't come to us naturally, and it's a little harder. But what I could put out there for those of you listening in the broader space of sharing is sometimes it's just really valuable to share and get that insight from other people, and you'll be surprised how many people will share back.
That's great. And I think you're right. I think that is a key takeaway. I think we would all be surprised by what you hear back. And I think that's one thing that we have also, emphasized to HR and wellbeing teams, because often there's a chicken and egg, sorry to use that metaphor in this context, but, with respect to, well, we don't know how many of our employees will want to actually engage with us about these topics. And the point is actually, well, it won't be anyone if you don't signpost that you're available to listen to them. And I also want to mention, though, I thought you were paying Artie a compliment when you said that she was super chatty, and I'm still going to take it as a compliment on her behalf. But I also
Absolutely.
want to signal to, you know, HR and well-being managers, not everyone will necessarily want to be chatty about it or even proactive or even very vocal about it. And so signposting doesn't mean that that success metric is, oh, everyone's sharing their personal journey. It is even just adding to somebody's peace of mind that they don't have to be paranoid about saying something, slipping up, you know. And, you know, I mentioned I went through during, I didn't tell anyone in my workplace in 2017. I'm an introvert. I may not be the type of person who would openly share that in a work context. You know, I think women at work, you know, struggle with lots of different things where we get, you know, in speech marks, penalized for talking about children versus where men will get regaled for talking about going home to their children. And so there's a big range of reactions. And so I do want to stress to folks on the webinar that we're not suggesting we all, you know, sit around a campfire and everyone talks openly about it. But what makes the difference is the signaling and the signposting that the office, the workplace, is a safe place to have these conversations. And if people do want to ask for support, it's available at the organization. So I think that's the key. Kunal, people have asked some questions of you, if you don't mind me sort of teeing them up, because I do think it's actually better to do this as we go versus, you know, us having some kind of a chat and then Q&A at the end. So somebody was asking, and first of all, thanking you for sharing your journey, but they want to know how well supported you were then by your employer. And I think you've alluded to policies, you've alluded to sort of time off in your manager, but do you mind sort of specifying that?
Sure. So I felt extremely well supported. Like I said, first off, you know, with empathy and emotion, and a broad acceptance of needing the time off occasionally for this. It was, I never felt that I had to punch in or punch out if I had to be away. We support hybrid working, which actually is really helpful sometimes when you need to go to an appointment and you know, come back home with your wife, because sometimes these appointments are quite emotional, and you don't want to have to rush straight back to work from there. And at times like this, I found Monzo very supportive. From a policy perspective, we also have a policy that gives us time off after a miscarriage, which was sadly needed in our case, and I was very grateful for it. And of course, you know, once we did find that we were pregnant and you know, had to have a baby, it is I think a very generous caregiver leave policy that I'm currently enjoying. So you know, across the range, I found both from a pure policy perspective as well as from an emotional support perspective and just a very humane perspective, very supported. Of course, I now know that we've signed up with you, Eileen. This well, fortunately for Monzo, slightly less fortunately for me, happened after I'd been through some of my journey. But I'm sure we would have been even more supported had we signed up sooner. But that's where we are.
Thanks for that. And I love that you keep stressing that the first important point is empathy. So maybe to recap, and maybe for the person who had asked, in case people are interested, what the range of support that, you know, for instance, workplaces that we work with provide, or what we've seen across the market. Maybe I'll just do a recap, and obviously Kunal's just outlined what he got at Monzo, but again, I'll stress it was led with empathy. I would suggest that written policies just demonstrate that someone took the time to write up a piece of paper to say, we have, you know, a fertility policy, an IVF policy, a surrogacy policy, or a fertility policy more broadly, or a reproductive health policy. And that does take time, and it does take thought and consideration. So to put in there, what I'm trying to stress is it doesn't have to include financial reimbursement. It doesn't necessarily have to include, you know, budget. But having a policy in place is one of these things I was alluding to earlier, which is a signal and an indicator that this workplace has considered this, knows that this could really be impactful to employees' well-being and productivity in the office or at work with colleagues, and that you've thought about it and you've actually thought about whether or not there will be additional paid time off for some of these journeys, whether there won't be, whether it'll be sickness leave, whether there will be any financial consideration, whether there will be flexible working, and just to have that piece of paper, because by policy, one as an employee will see what has been considered and what has been ruled out or what has been ruled in. And I think, so starting with the policy is incredibly important. Starting with, again, you could have events. So we work with clients sometimes on lunch and learns, bespoke webinars, workshops, for example. We also share examples of policies, best practice. And I think somebody has actually just sort of certified there. Since somebody just actually asked that, when you say some policies as an examples of best practice, there really is, we're not here to judge, certainly us as Fertifa, what an organization will deem as commercially, I guess, appropriate for their policy. But the range is everything from, this is the policy, and you can take, part of your sickness leave, you can take part of your annual leave, i.e. there's no extra leave, which again, doesn't require extra budget or doesn't have extra consideration, but speak to your manager, go to this place. Or we see in policies, people just post to, for more information, you can go to these third-party websites, for example. You can go to ACAS to know what your rights are. You can go to the NHS, which talks about IVF. You can go, and obviously at Fertifa, we would have lots of resources that we can offer if that's a benefit that's available or sort of educational material that's available to a workplace. But my point is the policies can range from it's just a piece of paper or online, a Notion page or whatever it might be on an intranet that outlines and clarifies for employees what thought has gone into the policy, whether there's any budget behind it or not. And that policy can just establish what's included, what's not. It can go all the way up to then providing well-being support, whether it's through a company like Fertifa or another, and actually care advice, navigational support. It could include diagnostics, treatment, testing. It could include actual payment or reimbursement of costs or cost share, we've often found, or it could just include, again, signposting to a way to get access to financing for supporting through these journeys. So the policies, there's really no best practice, I would say. I guess you could describe there are some that require more budget versus those that require no budget at all. But my starting point was having a policy in place really makes a difference with that signposting and actually reinforces or is the way that empathy is first conveyed. So I think those are all the points. And like Kunal has mentioned, then there is the consideration of additional or maybe not time off, flexible working in order to accommodate appointments. And then of course, there's the cost point of view. Thanks for that, Kunal. I think the other thing I definitely want to make sure we get to, because I know you and I have spoken about it, you've alluded to it with Artie, and it was one of our top 5, and I will recap what those 5 points are for everyone. I am now going to leave it as somewhat of not a cliffhanger, because I've already given it a spoiler in the beginning, but I will leave it for the end. But we will recap the 5. But one of them was balancing work with these journeys. And we are talking about this in the workplace. It is about fertility challenges for employees. Therefore, the supposition is that everyone who is, this is applicable to, works at a company that's hopefully represented by somebody that's on this webinar. And so how do you balance going through this, whether it's multiple cycles, one cycle, even just the investigation, the research, the diligence, deciding what to do? How do you balance that with work? Do you mind sharing how you and RT sort of ended up doing that, and then I'll come back and try and round that out.
Sure, and let me start by saying I mean that it isn't easy. As supportive as the workplace is, it's a huge commitment to go down this path, and one that folks don't, and I don't think they do, and so they shouldn't take lightly. But it's absolutely worth investing the time up front in research, and I can share with you a couple of research steps we took and some missteps that we took in this process, and in terms of, I'll bring it back to how we balance it at work, and I'll also share some of the tougher calls we had to make when that balance went sideways for us. So in the first set of instances, I would we attended a number of open houses. A lot of private fertility clinics run open houses, and they're very thoughtfully in the evenings. So it wasn't too much of a strain to get out of work the extra half an hour early or to make it over to Central London where tend to be, certainly in London where they tend to be. And that's a really helpful place to start because it gives you a sense of what you're more or less comfortable with. And we started at a clinic on Harley Street and did a couple of rounds with them, one of which was marginally successful, but realized that wasn't right for us, and that was in the back of, in part, some of those conversations I talked about sharing and getting feedback from other people, but also ongoing research in terms of what works for us. We found that that particular clinic was had very high success rates, but that was on the back of some very severe medication that they chose to use, and that may have been good for some, but wasn't good for us. And so we had to switch clinics about a year into the process. And so yes, so researching and take the time early in the process to understand what works for you, to know that you're going to have to make a number of trips, more than you imagine, to the clinic, and so distances and accessibility are important, and also to understand the cost. Okay? And different clinics work in different ways. What I wish we had was some independent guidance, somebody who we could not friends who've been through it, which is always wonderful, but actually professionals who could help us answer some of the harder questions and sort through some of our options for us. And I think that would be very helpful if you could have access to that kind of service. And then the second part of the question is balancing it out, and sometimes the balance works and sometimes it doesn't. My wife worked in digital learning at a fairly well-known private school in Southwest London, and it's a 40-minute commute from home. And as we were going through the process, we realized about a year and a half in, especially after our second miscarriage, that the demands from her school, which is quite full time, you can't bail on being in school when you need to be in school, right? Especially as an educator, were just too much for us. We couldn't do it. The physical toll on her, and emotionally, and the need to be away to go to get tested at specific times of the month and at specific times of the day, because that's what the cycle demands, meant that she'd quit. And we took that call, and that has a meaningful financial impact. She chose to quit working. They asked her to stay on and do contract work, which she agreed to do for a few more months till she dialed that down as well. But that was all part of that journey. And I think it's really important that folks understand that sometimes there are certain work types of patterns that can't afford to be as flexible as others. That's just a reality. And then as the couple that's going through this, you need to take some of those decisions, and sometimes they aren't the easiest decisions to take.
No, I appreciate you sharing that. And obviously, as you say, huge financial impact to be able to consider that, but also I'm sure, it was a luxury, and well done to you and Artie for taking that decision so that she could do that and focus on the journey. Given that, most of our audience, I think most of the participants will be from HR and wellbeing teams or managers who are considering how to best support employees, my sense would be that would be the scenario they're looking to avoid, right? The whole point of this is we want to all support employees and colleagues who are going through these journeys, be mindful of what they're going through, and ensure that they can hopefully stay productive but fulfilled in their roles, and also continue to be a really strong contributor as they are to their teams and to their companies. And so that does kind of almost bring us full circle. It's the reason we're having this conversation. I'd like to think, and I hope Artie did get support from the workplace, but it does sound like obviously there were constraints based on it being a learning environment, and maybe there's only so much that could be done. One of the other things that you mentioned was, it would have been great to get access to independent advice. I just wanted to say, I did not ask Kunal to say that, but that is what Fertifa does. And it is that point about impartial, independent advice is really helpful, because so much of the uncertainty, the angst, the anxiety, the consideration, the time spent researching is mostly about, am I doing the right thing? What are the things I should be considering? What do I don't know what I don't even know. What else should I be asking? And again, whether it's for Tifa or another organization, this isn't an advert, we're having a conversation about what hopefully helps employees across all sectors. That independent advice, which unfortunately is very rarely, if ever, fulfilled by an EAP program or existing solutions or benefits, is so critical. And that is, we're at the heart of it here at Fertifa, and that is what we do. And that's why we've convened this conversation. But I do think that's such a big piece of hopefully helping people balance their other demands. And it might be, by the way, existing commitments outside of work as well. It might also be balancing it with other caregiver responsibilities or other things that are going on and work all at the same time. So along those lines, then somebody else has sort of asked, just generally speaking, and Kunal, you mentioned actually the open houses at private fertility clinics, for example, are often in the evening times. I will sort of say, obviously, with NHS, there's often a little bit less flexibility, if not a lot less flexibility. But somebody has asked, generally, and I have a feeling our answer is probably going to be too vague to be satisfactory, but how much time and over what period of time do people, so if you could give your experience, Kunal, be great, in fertility journeys usually have to spend for the research, the appointments, the tests. I guess the idea is before the actual treatment cycle, which I think most people will presume takes a month. And of that, what would typically be outside of working hours and what would be within working hours where paid time off would have helped. Do you mind sharing your view of that?
Yeah, sure. So if we break this up really into three blocks, right? One is the pre-treatment work, and then there's treatment, and then there's the outcome of treatment. Let's call it that, because that outcome of treatment could have a range of outcomes. I think it's fair to say that the pre-treatment work can be done on personal time. Okay, especially if they can be supported with independent advice. I think that makes it much easier for them to not need the extra time off. Open houses, the NHS comment, not understanding for a second. The private open houses, they know that the people attending them work, right? And so they do them in the evenings. They typically start at 6:30 in the evenings, and run for an hour and a half. They tend not to be independent. Actually, I found a couple of them quite pushy. And so that's just worth doing, and that's where the independent independent advice comes into play. So I think that first bit, desktop research, coming on your own time, coming on weekends, it is a commitment that the individual is making, after all, to wanting to start a family, and that is an important commitment. And so I think that bit, supported by advice, is totally fine to be done on your own time. I think the middle bit, which is the actual treatment, that's harder. Okay, one, because it's done naturally following a woman's natural cycle. They tie it to cycles, and sometimes that doesn't happen to be on a weekend, and so you need the time off, and you need to go into the clinic. So a lot of these cycles are quite medicated, and they have quite meaningful impacts on hormone levels, and they can go up and down, and sometimes you just need that day off, right? You really just do. And I think having the flexibility to take that day off, sometimes without a lot of pre-warning, because you just don't know how you're going to feel in the morning after a procedure, is really helpful. And so I think that's the area that I think is worth spending time on, as you think about how you write policies to support folks. And then the last piece, which is the outcome of a cycle, which could be It just didn't work. You know, very often a cycle doesn't work, and then you take a call to do another or not. Sometimes the decision to not do another cycle is a very big decision because you're calling time on the process, and you might need some time to process that. Or it worked and you're pregnant, great. And sometimes it worked and you start out pregnant and don't stay that way. And that's when you actually really need some compassionate time off.
Great, thank you, Kunal. I think if I can maybe try and summarize it or maybe extrapolate a bit from there, as you said, I think a lot of the pre-treatment, i.e. the research, the investigation can probably be done outside of working hours in one's personal time. I will say, just from my personal experience, I did end up Googling almost all day though at work, sort of the following morning, or sort of, because you're sitting in front of a laptop or a computer in a lot of cases. And, even if I had started research the night before, I sort of, oh, I should check this. So it does affect productivity. I will admit, at least it affected mine. But yes, much of that can be compartmentalized and may or may not require time off. Although if a workplace offers well-being days, for example, that might be the perfect way for somebody to take some time to collect their thoughts and think about how they're going to research. Again, as Kunal said, and I would emphasize again, independent, impartial advice from some source, whether it's fertility or otherwise, I think really helps that whole process and can probably compress it even into sort of a couple of conversations rather than several days or several evenings or even weeks. The treatment cycle, to the person who asked the question, I think even if we just all assume that's going to be within a month, to Kunal's point, the paid time off, I think, is really helpful because not only will be the sort of days or the trigger days of when the hormone injection starts, where somebody might need to take that time off. There's clearly also a transfer day, a collection day, a transfer day. There are surgical procedures that happen during the cycle that again would, some people maybe don't need a full day off, just need a few hours and want to go back to work to distract themselves. But for others, there may be cramping, there may be side effects, and they might want to not go back to work afterwards. So again, to tie a couple of questions together, because others have asked for, best practice or examples of policies, I've seen a recent corporate's a very large employer, 40,000 employees. It has a blend of what I guess we'd call head office employees, as well as sort of front office or retail or sort of, front of house types employees. And they offer 6 days of paid leave per treatment cycle, as an example. If that feels overly generous, 1 day, goes a long way as a gesture, 2 days, 3 days. But considering, a number of days per treatment cycle, I think does really help for what, again, would affect somebody. And then also maybe those days could also be taken depending on the outcome or the results of the treatment cycle. So
just to,
yeah.
if I may jump in, I think just whether it's 1 or 2 or 6, acknowledging that you're going to need time off, and the organization understands that is huge. It's huge because it would let me know, or would have let Arti know that, hey, this is okay. And if the policy was 1 day and it was a difficult cycle, you needed 2, that the company is open to actually having that conversation with you, as opposed to just not having any policy at all. I think it makes a huge difference to actually have a written policy.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks, Kunal. So other questions that are going to be sort of asked, again, people thinking about, I guess, benchmarking, how to compare and contrast. And I can give an answer again from what I've seen from the Fertifa side. I don't know if, Kunal, you've got a view, at Monzo, again, before Fertifa was introduced, you felt you were able to obviously talk to the organization about what you were going through. Do you think you would have had the same assistance for preservation, i.e. egg or sperm freezing, which was another question that was asked?
I think so, but I think that's a function of Monzo. And I wouldn't have felt the same way that, previous employers, where I might have been able to have a conversation about actually, needing fertility treatment and wanting to have a family, versus a conversation about potentially egg freezing. And so I do want to highlight that it's actually worth, being clear as an org about those two, and the differences between them. I do feel, however, I could have, but I do want to believe that it's a function of of the company.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think it's probably worth saying, one of the reasons we were keen to have you on, I mean, Monzo, I don't know how many on the webinar will know, but, Monzo is very well known within banking, within financial services, for actually being incredibly progressive with respect to benefits and support. Was the first actually to introduce pregnancy loss leave, for example, and have a policy on that. And so maybe some then therefore might be on the webinar and think, well, of course, Monzo is going to be supportive, Canal, and, great that you got that. But thinking about an organization where maybe it's not as embedded in the culture, perhaps, or maybe where, from the executive, the signaling hasn't been the same, where HR and wellbeing teams feel like they can introduce something. Do you have any, again, as somebody who's gone through the journey, probably less as somebody who's maybe worked directly with the HR team or your people team on the policies, any suggestions on how, again, to start the conversation, even from a, getting buy-in from the organization point of view about policies or support?
Well, for one, as you refer to say, start the conversation, and we have teams that help us think about diversity and inclusion, and I think having policies like this are really important markers for diversity and inclusion. Focus groups with your staff who have either been through the process or are going through the process. It's also really helpful. Ask them what they need. Ask them where where they feel the organization came up short. Gather that body of evidence. Do the benchmarking. Ask Eileen to share what that benchmarking is with you all, and then make that case, to your execs. It is, going through fertility treatment and IVF and the outcomes of those are better known than you give it credit, than you may give it credit for. So many people have been through the journey. So many people know so many people who've been through that journey. You might find, you're pushing against a wide open door when you have that conversation.
Thank you. And so, yeah, I think that it is sort of the sort of same view, which is, you really have to start the conversation. You can start it by, we have lots of stats, I can rattle some off now. For heterosexual couples, 40% of those challenges happen to be male factor issues. 1 in 6 heterosexual couples will face a fertility challenge. Again, as I said earlier, 100% of LGBT individuals will need some form of support, if not assisted reproductive technology, in order to become parents. And so, trying to appeal to the fact that this is a much broader situation and set of circumstances that affect people than we would have otherwise thought, because most people have been keeping it to themselves. It's probably the best starting point. We've got another question where, again, somebody's thanked you, Kunal, and I thank you again for sharing your personal story and making it so personal and letting us get some of that insight. Somebody though has asked about, if there's suggestions, advice, or perspectives on the support that's available for someone who's part of a couple and as a partner. So for example, whether, at Monzo, when you started talking about it, people, assumed you were talking about Artie. And so there was sort of this certain context versus if somebody was single and going through something themselves, whether that was preservation or IVF, pathway to parenthood. And if there's anything that you thought would be different for that.
I was actually, is this the question that's up here? I was just trying to read as well. About the individual who went through the opening stages as a single woman. Is that
Correct.
the question you're referring to?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. I think this for me is a really important indicator of how a company thinks about diversity. Lots of companies publish stats on gender pay gaps and ethnicity breakdown, etc. But actually, genuine diversity is so much deeper than your gender or your ethnicity. It is about who you are and what's important to you. And And so absolutely, they should be, broad openness to somebody who wants to go through a fertility process, irrespective of their personal status, whether they're in a relationship or not. And I personally feel quite strongly about that. Um, and I think all of us, should think really long and hard about what diversity means to us in our workplaces, and how best we can respect a wider definition of the term.
I think it's a great answer, and I was nodding vehemently because, again, we didn't really actually do much of a briefing or dry run on this, but that's exactly what I would have said too. So first of all, thank you for the person who shared that question, and for sharing about your journey. Really, sorry to hear that you didn't have as much support actually from your employer, because they sort of presumed you were getting support elsewhere, either from a partner or otherwise. Just as Kunal said, I think when we think about supporting colleagues and employees, we do really have to think about the whole population and the breadth of diversity and experiences, and how everybody's going through it differently, and how circumstances could be differently. So, that same question could have applied to, whether younger individuals are getting the same degree of support as those who might be, whatever, perceived as middle-aged, or older employees are getting the same support, because maybe someone might judge it as, why are you bothering if you're that age, or again, your relationship status, but also, as I've also alluded to, your sexual orientation, and whether or not somebody assumes, oh, I didn't know you were married, or I didn't know you were there yet. And again, none of these judgments should be applied. The support should be available to every single individual. We have to make sure that it is universally accessible, and therefore fully inclusive. And so, yeah, going back to exactly what Kunal said, if an organization is firmly committed to diversity and inclusion, you'd want to make sure that there's coverage and well-being support inclusively available to everybody, and that it is so sort of readily available. And it applies to sort of diverse people. I think I'll just take that opportunity to sort of tie it into what we said the first challenge would be when I did the top 5. And if it looked like I wasn't concentrating there, people have asked me to put it in the chat. So I have typed the top 5 now in the chat, and I'll share that in a second. But the first one was regarding increasing challenges getting access to fertility support through the NHS in the UK or public healthcare system. And again, back to inclusivity, even when the NHS, which does such great work, does provide, up to 3 cycles at certain NHS trusts for IVF cycles, that has typically been for, a woman of a certain age, of a certain BMI, in a heterosexual relationship, in a marriage or a civil partnership, with no children from a previous relationship. So if a workplace is relying on the NHS or a public healthcare system to provide this kind of support, it's really not inclusive. It really won't be enabling, all of their employees to feel genuinely supported in the workplace, which is why, again, it's really important to think about the policies. So I think that we have covered off, oh, I know, the very last question that I haven't actually answered is for the top 5. I am going to hit return then on this. I'll share it in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see it. Those are the top 5. And I guess just to recap, I won't read them now that I've actually shared them in the chat, but I think what I really want to sort of tie back together, and I sort of believe in these days of back-to-back Zoom calls, by the way, Kunal, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to try and wrap it 5 minutes, 6 minutes early, so people have time before they have to get onto their next call and maybe switch contexts. But, we've talked so much about this top 5 that I've just pasted into the chat. I think the key highlights are, I'm taking this from you, I'm stealing it from you, Kunal, everything has to start with empathy. It doesn't matter if a policy isn't written down. It doesn't matter if the policy has budget or not. It has to come from empathy, and actually offering empathy is the best and the most important thing to do in the first place. Having said that, what'll reflect that empathy and channel that empathy, especially if somebody as an employee isn't really going to put themselves out there to start the conversation or open it in the first place, is having inclusive policies written down. Again, it doesn't have to include a drastic budget, but having a policy written down and taking the time to do that. Potentially then working with somebody, doesn't have to be Fertifa, who can offer independent, impartial advice and sort of just be there, so that as an extension of the organization, really, it's saying, we've got your back. we're here for you. We're here to help answer your questions. Because, you know, something you did mention, but you touched on, but I didn't come back to, Kunal, these open houses that you can attend at private fertility clinics. I went to some of those, and you don't know if they're telling you what's right for you, or if they're telling you because you're about to pay a pretty significant amount of money for a treatment cycle, right? So that impartial advice really, really is key. And then creating the supportive environment, which could be enabled by flexible working, flexible hours, potentially paid time off, but actually just offering a safe place. And then finally, just, you know, having more conversations like these. And I cannot thank everybody on the call, or I say call, but the webinar enough. There are still more than 100 people with us, and we really appreciate all of your attention, all of the commitment that you've made to actually allocate the time in order to think about, you know, what's available, what's best practice, to ask us what some personal journeys have been, some examples, and to join us in this conversation. We would love to continue the conversation, I guess asynchronously. Kunal's been brilliant putting himself forward. I'm sure he wouldn't mind, you know, he said when he starts talking about it, it's amazing what comes back. If people want to have conversation of that, just let us, you know, you know, and yeah. Kunal's also made the point about the open houses with the fertility clinics all have pictures of really cute babies in the waiting room. By the way, that just adds to anxiety, doesn't it? It's just, it's so much pressure. So again, thanks to all of you for joining the webinar to think about how you can support employees and colleagues that might be going through these things that Kunal has experienced, I've experienced, but so many more are experiencing now, and probably too afraid or too timid to speak about because they're not sure whether or not it's the right thing to do at work. If people have follow-up questions, queries, they can always get in touch with us at Fertifa. We'll pass on any messages to Kunal. I'll spare him sort of advertising his touch points, although you are pretty vocal too, as on behalf of Monzo as a general manager. And the last thing I want to say is thank you, Kunal, again, during your caregiver leave, to spend the time with us, to share your journey, to share your experiences, your very personal journey. We're very, very pleased, you know, over the moon about your newborn and the baby that we didn't get to see, but we're grateful that you sort of borrowed some time from her to spend with us. So thank you again, everybody joining, and thank you, Kunal.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor to be on. Thank you.
Oh,
and good luck.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Thank you.